So anyway, we're gonna do, um, just for fun, we're gonna do who are the greatest investors of all time. I saw a video the other day that talked about this, and I was struck by how all these investment professionals. I actually kind of agreed with some of their choices and some of their reasoning, but I was struck how maybe they didn't really know all the history and all the biographies to really decide. And I thought it would be interesting also to discuss why should we want to know who the greatest investors of all time are? Like, what lessons can we potentially learn from them? I have with me, as usual, Steve Cohen, podcast producer extraordinaire, the man with all the quotes and all the sports trivia.
Thank
Steve's
you.
promised he will keep words to only 15% of the words discussed. And also, Merrick first.
He generates a lot of words. So is that like
Yes.
you're measuring time or number of words?
I always tell him, just take out every other word.
Okay.
And then it's okay. And Merrick first hasn't been on the podcast before. Merrick, thanks for coming on. Just as way of intro, you're college dean extraordinaire. What's your actual
Professor, yeah.
title at Georgia Tech?
I'm a distinguished professor at Georgia Tech, and I run an institute called the Center for Deliberate Innovation.
Right. So, and at that center, you've incubated many
Yeah, we've
companies.
started 93 companies from scratch there.
And two, you mentioned to me the other day, have over $1 billion valuations now.
Well, collectively, they're about 2.1 billion at the moment.
Right. So, arguably, you have an eye for good investments and value and finding people who you're willing to invest in, who've created a lot of value for you. And I want to mention, because I always do, you were the dean of students at Carnegie Mellon when I was at grad school there, and your signature is on the letter that threw me out. I don't hold it against you. We've become best friends since then.
But you bring it up a lot.
I bring it up because it's so funny.
That's funny.
that you're here instead of just crapping on me for the past 30 years.
No, not that way. Yeah.
Why not? Why couldn't you have just said, "Oh, this guy was using us"? And
I don't know, because that's not how I experienced you. I experienced you as like you were probably the smartest graduate student we had, and my situation was the faculty was saying you got to kick this guy out because I don't care how smart he is, he's never showing up, and we're paying him a salary. And I feel like I saved you for like a year. I kept telling him it doesn't matter. Someday you'll do something really great in this area. When you figure out like how to figure out how to, that's we'll see better than most of what everybody else has done. And then one day they said, but you know what? There are students who we can't bring here because we don't have the salary because we're spending it on James, whatever it was, like $7,000 a year, whatever it was back then. And so
which by the way,
I couldn't win. So then I had to write you this letter. But we were friends, and actually one of the best things in my life was being able to figure out how to write you that letter and then stay friends. And you're one of my longest running friends, and I appreciate that.
What did the letter say?
Huh?
Don't let the door hit you on the way out, James.
No.
Well,
it took you that long to write
letter?
that.
Do you still have the letter?
I don't. I threw away all my
That's good.
belongings. But
Yeah.
but the thing is, I didn't fight the letter. I agreed with it actually, and then we ran into a cafe. I was studying chess games, and we started playing chess and so on. And then we've been good friends ever since.
I think we were friends before that. We were walking around talking about stuff. You had always wanted to be a writer.
Yeah.
You had other thoughts that you had talents all over the place.
And we were talking the other day on the podcast about the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the bias that you think you're good at something when people have a tendency to think they're better at something than they are, particularly things that they're passionate
in some
about.
ways, they're so bad at it, they don't even notice that they're bad.
Right. So as a writer back in 1991, I was so bad, but I thought I should be published immediately. But I was saying there's a positive aspect, which is that it kept me going until I finally turned the corner and started publishing.
Yeah.
Which took like 10 years. But thanks to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
But you didn't actually have it.
I didn't.
Well,
Oh, well, maybe.
I think they're really, really bad at it. And they're so bad at it that they can't even notice that they're bad at it, and then they'll never get good at it.
Yeah,
So
that's a problem.
it's one thing to mistake an actual talent, then maybe that keeps you going.
Well, and by the way, with investing, a lot of people, I would say the average person on the street who's just started trading thinks they have an edge over everyone else. And I think to be a great investor, the first rule of thumb is you always have to ask yourself, what is your edge? And so when we're looking at the best investors of all time, they must have had extreme edges to be better than the other billions of people on the planet. So, or let's say millions of people who are trying to be good investors. So, do you want to start off talking who are the greatest investors of all time?
Well, if you want to go down that path, Charlie Munger would be a place to start.
All right, so let's talk about Charlie Munger for a second. So Charlie. Do you want to describe who Charlie Munger is? Do you want me to?
Partner of Warren Buffett, but you wrote the book. In fact, the
Well,
first book I ever saw that you wrote, you came and you handed it to me, and it was How to Trade Like Warren Buffett, which
Yeah.
I think the secret was he wasn't
oh.
trading. But yeah, so you should
I
probably
was
start.
thinking a more effective way to start,
Oh yeah, go.
with all due deference, is that like maybe talk about the impetus for this video. Like you saw them talk about this. They mentioned 5 or 6 people.
Right, they mentioned
then-
5 or 6 people,
Right.
and it was
then we can get into like the
it was and again, I am not like their video was a good video. I'm not but and I kind of agreed with some of their choices and some of their reasoning.
4 or the 5.
Hmm?
I think you agreed with the 4 or the 5. Maybe perhaps we should just talk about the 5 or 6 that they mentioned, and
Well,
other people in the periphery, or maybe not.
yeah, we'll mention
Yeah.
them throughout.
Okay, fine.
But I was just disturbed, not disturbed, but I was thinking this would have been more interesting if they told us the lessons you can glean from each of these investors. Like, what
Yes.
does a great investor mean? Because that was a little unclear. And also, they didn't really know a lot of the history and biographies of these investors and other investors who they could have considered. And I think it's important. Not that you need to know every fact, and we'll miss some facts here, but I think it's important in any industry that you want to be an expert in. And you know, all of these people are professionals. I've been
Yeah.
a professional investor for 20 years. You kind of want to know the history of what you're doing. So it reminds me, speaking of chess, it reminds me how when Bobby Fischer was 13 years old. He was a good young chess player, but he wasn't the best. And he took a year off. All he did was study the history of chess. He came back and he knew every single game played in the 1800s. So everyone was thinking, "Oh, this is old school. We're gonna beat him easily." But he worked on improvements on every single game, and then won the
Yeah.
U.S. championship at the age of 15. It was like amazing. He won like every game.
I think, I think that's why we got interested in things like who are the best 5 investors, or why you're interested in Bobby Fischer, because somehow they achieved something extraordinary. Then you have the sense that, well, that's actually something that I or someone else might want to achieve. And then how did they do that? Was it
Yeah.
just lucky, or did they actually? So you're saying like with Bobby Fischer must have had some talent, but then he moved away and he focused on something and he came back with something. And one could even you could imagine doing that yourself. I don't know that you would do that yourself. So I think the same thing is going on with these investors. Like when I listened to that same podcast, they were describing like what they would describe Soros, or they would describe Charlie Munger or somebody, and then you they didn't get into the thing which was like how did they do it? Like what
Right.
makes it possible? Like, and
Right,
then the
or
question
what
is like, why are we interested in investors at all? It's like because we all, even if we only have $1, there's like some sense you could do something and more could come back. So it's like a human thing you want to do, and how do you get better at it?
Right. And what's interesting to me in the Bobby Fischer story, which is applies exactly to their video and these investors, these great investors knew the history of their professions. That's how they become the greatest. When you look at like artists, Andy Warhol doesn't say to himself, I think it would be really neat to paint a Campbell soup can. He knows the entire history of art and he asks himself, he was already the best illustrator in the world. He was working in the ad agency business and he was known as the best illustrator in the ad agency business. He was a great drawer or artist or whatever already. But he asked himself, in just the history of art, what has not yet been done? And the first thing he wanted to do was pixelated comic books. But then his buddy Roy Lichtenstein had just started doing it. So he's like, oh, I can't do that. And so that's when he switched to the Campbell soup can and he created pop art, becoming one of the greatest artists of all time. So knowing the history and knowing what you can do differently is what makes in any field someone great, and that particularly applies to these investors, but they didn't really scratch below the surface. They gave us the names, but they didn't say the lessons we can all learn related to this.
Right.
What was it that they did differently? What
Yes.
can we do differently? How can we think
Yeah, it's
differently?
interesting because you could imagine a basketball player. So you're 7-1. Is that you can't teach someone else to be 7-1. But even the people that are unbelievably great, there is this sense that they've become deliberate about it. There's like something that they've noticed about how they're going about it, and maybe about how other people have gone about it. Then they become deliberately better. And
Well, and we can address this because
Yeah.
remember when John Wallace was on the podcast? So
Yeah.
John Wallace played for the Knicks, and John Wallace was, I think, like 6'9", 7'0".
6'8", 6'9". Yeah.
And he said there's plenty of 6'8", 6'9" people bagging groceries.
yeah,
And he went to his mentor, coach, every single day, showed up at 7 in the morning with a basketball, lost, would play him in basketball, lost every day for like 6 years in a row, and then finally started beating him. Boom. Then he was on the New York Knicks.
So here's a weird question. So investing just requires like perhaps having capital and a place to put it. So unlike basketball, where you got to be like tall, perhaps. So can anyone become the world's greatest investor if they only figure out how to do it?
If they figure out how to do it, but that's a big if. That's a big if,
Yeah.
right? Because you have to have that edge. You have to say, what can I do that nobody else is doing, and everybody else is afraid to do. So it's sort of like that Peter Thiel question: what do I believe that no one else believes? I think that's the question. I don't know the exact
But the
question.
other thing, to Merrick's point though, like those investors that they picked, they utilize a lot of different strategies too. Like
Yes.
they have Jim Simons, who is a quant, or the people do high frequency trading, or but yes, I think Merrick and I were talking earlier about you could definitely be better than you are, right? Like like we could all learn a lot. You can become a better investor. You may not be able to be like them, and a lot of what those people did, whether it's Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger or George Soros, who they mentioned, like it doesn't apply now. Like it's a different
No,
environment.
that's right, but it's just
Yeah.
like tennis,
Yeah.
right? Jimmy Connors, who's one of the greatest tennis players of all time, if you put him on a tennis court, even the Jimmy Connors at his peak from like
Yeah.
1977, if you put him on a tennis court right now against the best tennis player of all time, he would lose every point.
Yeah.
It's just, Picasso did something different than Warhol. All of these investors that we're about to talk about did something different, but it's more the process
Sure.
of what makes a great investor and what can you learn from it and where did they go that nobody else was willing to go? Because I think to your point, Merrick, you said, okay, you have money, you put it and you have something to invest in, and then you start to get better at it. But you have to kind of go where nobody else is going to be the greatest, to be the
Well,
one
especially,
that's
I mean,
ahead.
but and investing in particular, especially if you're like in a situation where it's zero sum. So if you're in a place where a trade is there's a winner and a loser on the trade, then you have to go someplace where other people aren't going because you have to be on the winning side of the trade and the other people are on the other side of the trade.
Yeah,
But
and
not
I
but
think
not all investing is like that.
right.
So
That's right, and, because also the market in general has gone up, so not everyone has lost, what for everybody who's won. So it's not totally zero sum, but you'll see in the cases of some of these investors, they took advantage of zero-sum situations to make the most amount of money.
right.
But I'll narrowly define investor, by the way. We're not talking about venture capitalists because that's only for a certain group of people. We're not talking about people who invest in private companies. We're talking about specifically people
So you've
who
taken off the table almost everything that I know about, by the way.
yeah, but the
Okay.
concept of value and going to places where nobody else is going still applies. It's just I'm just excluding this group from the list because
Okay.
I can't emulate, for instance, what certain things that Ron Conway, who invested early in Google, did because
But
I didn't.
I'm gonna say I'm
Oh,
gonna tell you we're gonna get there. But
All right,
I bet the kinds of things you have to think about, the way you go about these things, actually is the same across the board.
I
So
agree.
that's
I agree with
and
that.
since
And
I've seen it more there, I might just bring it up, even if you tell me
yeah,
I can't. So
no, you can
yeah,
bring up the because I think the philosophies apply equally.
yeah.
It's just the list itself. I think is just because I think the average person on the street can listen to this and see people who also were at one time the average
You
person on the
have. I
street.
didn't realize you had average listeners, by the way. That just never occurred to me.
They're
So
very special,
okay.
which is why I think they can become the greatest investors, but they can't always move to Silicon Valley and invest
yeah.
in private companies. But Warren Buffett was living in Omaha, Nebraska,
Right.
and somehow became,
Yeah.
we can argue it, but is on my list as number one. Even though,
But I don't know that much about it. But weren't a lot of his investments in private situations? Did he just invest in publicly traded stocks?
he always invested in publicly traded
Huh.
stocks, particularly in the beginning of his career. Not as much
Did
now.
not know that.
Now he still does not invest. Well, we can go over it. There's
Yeah.
nuances, but in the first 10 years of his career, say his which you can argue is the greatest increase in his wealth before he was a billionaire. When you just go from
All right,
zero
so let's
to
start
50
there. Can
million,
we start there? Because
yeah,
this is like getting back to Steve's point. Okay, so that's what he did for the first 10 years. Can he still win at that?
no,
Yeah, I don't think so either. And
right.
so what changed?
Well, what changed was okay. I'll give you an example. So with Warren Buffett specifically,
Yeah.
because you mentioned Charlie Munger, which was phase two of his career, which we could talk about. But Warren Buffett was specifically interested in what Benjamin Graham, the who some consider the greatest investor of all time, but I would disagree. Benjamin Graham was his mentor and friend, and Warren Buffett applied his idea of buying cigar butt stocks. So a cigar butt is something you pick off a cigar butt off the sidewalk and it still has one puff left in it. So Warren Buffett, people think he's a buy and hold value investor. He holds forever. he would buy these companies that basically had more in basically cash or liquid assets than they were worth on the stock market, and he would basically wait for them or pressure them to liquidate the company. So let's say they were worth 50 million in terms of what they can liquidate, like they could sell it. They have a big garage sale and get 50 million, but they were only trading on the stock market for 20 million.
Mm.
He would buy those and pressure them to liquidate and then get out with his 2.5x return. But what's interesting is he didn't just, so you could say, why can't two questions you ask. Why didn't everybody do that then? And B, why can't people do that now? Both, you didn't ask those, but both are reasonable
Good
questions.
question. Well, why don't you pretend?
Those are the questions I was going to ask.
I'll ask him anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
So here's what he would do. This is
Yeah.
fascinating. He would, first off, he read, there wasn't any internet, obviously. He would get on paper all of the financial reports of
Right.
thousands of companies that were public. And all these companies, they weren't like big companies that represented by banks. No one was representing them. They were like barely public. And he would see, oh, here's this company located in Iowa that has a bunch of farm equipment. And if they just sell all the farm equipment and land that they own, I can get more money back than if I buy the whole company. So he would go to that town. He would borrow like a ride from a friend of his, and they would drive to this town in Iowa, and he would put up signs because he would figure the shareholders probably lived in the town. He would put up signs. If you own shares of XYZ farm company, call me. I'm staying at this hotel for the next 2 days. I'll buy them from you. He would usually buy them at a discount because nobody could sell them nobody was buying them on the stock market. They were as called trade by appointment, like they had no volume, nobody knew about them. And he would literally buy as many shares as he could in like 2 or 3 days, go home, and then start pressuring the company to liquidate. And he made all of his money.
So he was doing all sorts of things. And it wasn't just straight investing. Like he was figuring things out. And of course, in
Yes.
the public markets, it's a lot harder to have an information advantage now because there's so many these stocks people are spending who knows how much money trying to figure out like what's happened. I mean, there are people who are putting up satellites and watching uh, the
The
parking lots
yeah.
to be able to figure things out. So you're trying to compete with that kind of information gathering. But you're saying he was able to do that because he would like go there.
Right. So he had
And
an
then the
edge in that
second-
he read all the financial
And then
reports.
he was willing to try to acquire the shares in a way that nobody could acquire them.
Right.
So
Like
he
you
took
had to
steps.
physically go there.
Right.
So he was the only person physically going there.
Amazing.
And-
And then he would put on pressure to actually cause some
Right.
transaction to happen.
Right. He would put on pressure. In fact, a famous story with a little known textile company in Maine. They made like shirts or cloths or whatever. And he figured if they just liquidated all their assets, their manufacturing facility and so on, they would be worth, I'm going to make up numbers, but they would be worth $7. And now the stock's trading for 5. He'd go there, buy up as many shares as he could for 5. He'd pressure the CEO to do like a stock buyback at 6. And he would do this over and over again. And the guy would buy back for 6, and he then the stock would still trade at 5. He'd buy more shares at 5. He'd pressure again. And then one time the CEO said, "You know what, Warren? We've done enough of this. It's 6.25 now." I'm making up the numbers. I think it was actually
Yeah.
7.25. He said, "Warren, it's 6.25." And Warren's like, "No, we've always done 6. Don't change it." And he's like, "No, it's going to be 6.25." The CEO said. So Warren Buffett bought he bought 51% of the shares of the company. He fired the CEO. He took over the company. It's called Berkshire Hathaway. And then he started buying other companies completely in different industries.
Amazing.
So yeah. So that was Warren Buffett.
I didn't know the end of that story. But we go back to
Yeah.
just the beginning of the story because this is something I didn't know about venture world until I spent a lot more time in it, and it was like hard to figure this out. But the ones that are the best do it like that. They spend this enormous amount of time trying to find something about a company or an industry or a market or a product. Then they do that like on the ground. They actually go out, meet the customers. Then they find the person that has the shares, that is the startup that actually has the shares. Then they convince that startup to sell them the shares. So it's just like going there and trying to
Yeah.
buy the shares. But then they have to be involved in the exit. That they find a way to like find an acquirer or find a bank that will take them out to a public market. So the best venture investors are doing that thing that you described, that Warren Buffett, but all parts. You talk to people and say, yeah, we bought into this deal, but they didn't have the capacity to like force them to exit or make the exit happen. They don't make money.
Well, part of it obviously is like that they're reducing the risk and they're reducing the chance aspect of it. If Warren Buffett
Yes.
is involved in all of those things there, he's feeling like, hey, and James and I have discussed this before, just about like these people aren't as risk, they're more risk averse than one would think, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people think entrepreneurship and investing is taking a risk, when in fact, the best investors and the best entrepreneurs and the best venture capitalists, their job is to remove 99% of the risk.
Right.
Warren Buffett actually was so risk averse, he wouldn't invest in the company unless he knew he could just straight up liquidate their
Well, it was
farms.
good idea. You could buy it and you could get rid of it. Right.
Right.
All of these things are involved in investments.
And so your question of like, why can't you do it now? You sort of can do it now, but you have to kind of upgrade to the future. So you say, well, okay, this technology probably is going to work based on the research I've done, and there's a market of X for it. So right now it's worth less than some discounted version of that market. But that's
But
rough.
the
I'm not
opportunities are
done.
less. I guess what I'm thinking is the opportunities are less. So there's so much more
Yes.
information available. There's so many more people who have become sophisticated, and they've so professionalized the way that he went about it
Right,
that
like just doing what he did, like right now on the internet, I can do a search. What companies are worth less than their liquid assets? And some companies will come up, but you'll find when you dig deeper into those companies, there's a reason why they're worth less than those assets. Like
mm,
maybe those assets are hard to sell. Maybe there's a lawsuit against them. There's always now there's no easy, it wasn't easy for him either because he had to read thousands of financial documents to really, and then he had to understand what the farm market in Iowa was like to understand what the cost, what the potential exits were. But so it wasn't easy for him. But to even do what he did is impossible now. You have to figure out some way to upgrade that. But he upgraded it a little bit. You mentioned Charlie Munger earlier. So Munger and Buffett were very similar in that they were very consistent in their beliefs. They were very uh, they were always looking for value. But Munger had a different definition of value than Warren Buffett and Benjamin Graham. Munger said you have to include uh, the value of a brand, which is intangible, when you're making an assessment of value. And so Buffett didn't really agree with him, but they talked every day on the phone. And then one time, Buffett and this was the biggest investment Buffett ever made as a percentage of his net worth. One time there was a scandal. It was called the salad oil scandal. American Express insured some. I won't get into all the details, but they had a scandal that many people thought was going to ruin American Express. And so Warren Buffett, listening to Charlie Munger, went to the local steakhouse, sat behind the cash register, and saw how many people were paying for their meals with American Express. And he realized, oh, this is a powerful brand. People are not giving up using this just because of this weird scandal. And so he put a third of his hedge fund into American Express. I forget what he made specific on it because he sold throughout, but he made an enormous amount of money for his hedge fund investors and for himself. And that was really the one biggest People think, oh, Coca-Cola is his biggest investment because he made 10 billion on it. The biggest increase in his net worth was due to this American Express investment.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And it
Yeah,
was
so it's
only when he
interesting.
started taking Munger's advice that that brand has value. And that led to later investments in the Washington Post, Coca-Cola, and many of the investments that have made him famous.
Yeah, so I mean, so Munger gave a talk at Harvard Business School, which is on. You can find it on YouTube. I think it's about misjudgment. It changed my life hearing how he talked about that. Do you kind of know that? I mean, this. I
No,
wonder.
I
I
don't know
wonder
that
how
one.
brand comes into it. I mean, here's in a nutshell. You should go watch him say it because he says it so much more clearly. He said, Here's the problem with trying to buy things in a market is that it's basically the prices are kind of right because it's a parimutuel. Like the value of something that you're willing to buy is like what when someone's willing to sell it to you. So if you want to make money on a mispricing, you have to assume that someone's making a mistake. And how do those mistakes show up? And I guess if you go back and think about what Buffett might have been doing at the beginning is it wasn't so much mistakes, he was actually figuring something out that people didn't know. But
Right, so it wasn't quite a mistake, but it was like
uh,
they're either a mistake or there was a gap in knowledge,
yeah,
Cabin
so
knowledge, but another edge is like somebody needs to sell right away, and they know
right?
they're selling it low.
and that's a
Yeah,
different thing. So what
yeah,
Munger is saying is that human beings make misjudgments. They
yeah.
have cognitive errors. I mean, it's like before Kahneman and Tversky and that whole world of understanding, making errors in judgment, situations of uncertainty. And he said, if you can find situations in which people are making
Yeah.
cognitive errors, they just don't see the world right.
And what are some of those things? Like you're too close to it, so you can't. Too close
Well,
to
I
the
know
screen, you can't see the whole.
well, you believe Theranos. I mean, you buy in, I mean,
Yeah,
there's a whole mirage that makes a group of people believe that something is true,
but
which is just not true.
that's an emotional reason.
Also,
Well,
here's a
you're
common
saying it's
mistake.
emotional, but I think
Oh,
emotion doesn't have to feel like anything. It just feels like you're being right.
oh, interesting.
There's no feeling to being right. There's a
Yeah.
feeling to being wrong, but there's no feeling to be right. And so you don't have to say like they're caught up in it. Well, okay, they're caught up in it. But if they could notice they were caught up in it, then they wouldn't necessarily be caught up in it.
And also there's people make mistakes because also they want shortcuts. Like notice in this
Yeah.
Buffett case, he didn't really take a shortcut at all. There was no way he could have cut out any piece of what he did.
Yeah.
But people want to say, "Oh, because of this chart and it broke through this chart, I could buy it." And
Right.
they never really study the science or statistics about whether they're going to be right or wrong. They just read it in a book. If you break through this moving average on a chart,
Yeah.
you're probably going to have a buy. And so they make investment decisions off of wrong premises about how to invest as opposed to, and I'm not saying whether that works or not. By the way, it doesn't work. But so now I just said it. But you could statistically analyze by looking at the data and writing software or studying software that looked at the data and see if those strategies work. But many people don't do that. And those are the types of mistakes people make because they want shortcuts. That's one type of investment mistake.
Right. And so, I mean, but I think Munger's point was if you want to be a great investor, one way to think about it is how can you get your head straight? So, how can you recognize that the opportunity shows up when you are right and someone else is wrong?
Yeah. So
And,
how do you do that considering most people, to your point,
well,
always think they're right?
so maybe they are always right. I mean, that's sort of his point is that they more or less are always right because the prices are set in this parimutuel way, and we kind of agree on what the price is. Therefore, that's what the price is. And
Right,
so,
and
I
that's the
think for
theory that the market is, behaves in a rational way. So
Well, no, that's a different question because the market behaving the rational way would say that the pricing is actually what the price should be according to some actual value of the underlying thing, let's say discounted cash flow. That's different than saying the pricing is right in the sense of, well, if we've all agreed on what the price is, then that's what the price is. So even if and so
mm,
I can't make an advantage on it. And I think what's going on, I mean, I don't know this directly, of course, but my sense is that it's become harder because people are making these errors less. So I've talked to people at big investment companies. I shouldn't name the names. They said, here's the thing with the stock market. You throw darts at the stock market, as you point out, it goes up. That's not good decision making. If you can make slightly better decisions all the time, you can make a lot of money. So what's a slightly better decision? It's a question of that's sort of the heart of it. Like what makes you make a wrong decision? Like classic thing is you think you're right. And so why do you think you're right? Because everything that you see in the world reminds you that you're right. It's called confirmation bias. How does that work? I mean, it's weird. Your brain literally only notices the things that confirm. Like the minute I'll just show you how it could have been true for Warren Buffett. He saw people paying with American Express. Then every time he saw someone paying with American Express, he would convince himself he was right. But that's a big mistake because what you then don't notice is all the people that are paying with other credit cards, and you just
right.
think you're right. And so with something like that, you could get the whole world making a mistake because once they notice something, that's all they notice, and they don't notice the disconfirmations. So here's a way you could have an advantage. Everybody's saying one thing, you see all the examples. Force yourself to go look for the disconfirmations and see if maybe they're all wrong. And if they're not necessarily right, then there's an opportunity. But I think that's an example of the kind of thing that Charlie Munger said. There's like a few mental models. You can learn what those mental models are, and they stand you in good stead. But it's unbelievably hard to actually operate that way.
So I wonder if Buffett and I mean, they would have daily conversations for years at this point when this American Express thing took place. I wonder if Buffett had kind of the mental armor in place
Well,
to.
I'm sure Munger did.
And because, it wasn't like he said, "Oh, yeah, American Express is a good investment. Let's just try it, so I'll experiment with this." He put a third of his fund in it, which is
It's huge,
insane. He
right?
might even put more, but this was the biggest ri if this risk didn't work out, because people thought at the time American Express was gonna go bankrupt. So, if this risk didn't work out, he would have been out of business, and we talked about him being risk averse. That wasn't his style of
Uh,
psychology to do this.
so, how many of the investors that you would think of as the greatest investors of all time ever put themselves in a place where, on a single bet, they could have lost it all?
I mean, I would say in the top 10, there's probably a few. Like
So that
George Soros putting most of his fund into shorting the British pound in the early 90s.
So I think almost by definition that means that they can't be one of the greatest investors. They may have had one of the greatest outcomes, but I think they can't be one of the greatest investors because that move right there is such an irrational move because you can't control outcome.
Yeah, except so maybe I'm just thinking I'm right, so I'm now trying to find confirmation.
You
So
are
yes,
you're right.
no, you're right. But listing the greatest investors of all time, there's some uh what is it called, survivorship bias, because these are the ones we know about. All the great investors who eventually went broke, we don't are not being
Oh,
considered for this list.
I
Uh,
thought one of them they mentioned, who- I'm trying in the 30s where he like made 100 million, then lost it.
Oh,
Then
Jesse Livermore, who killed himself after he went
I
bankrupt.
thought like you might have a special place in your heart for him, not because he killed
No,
himself.
no, actually, because first off, I've read all the books about Jesse Livermore, and so
Yeah.
I know his story. I don't actually agree with his trading philosophy, and I think a lot like I considered another investor from that time, actually from a slightly earlier time, which was Bernard Baruch, who was a great investor. But back then, the laws around insider trading were a lot different, and so I kind of put a cutoff for myself, even though he probably was within the boundaries of what was considered legal then, or legal arbitrage then. I don't I think
Yeah.
he had advantages that are so far from what we have access to today and that were kind of unfair advantages that he was able to pay for, that even though he was a great investor, great philanthropist, probably a great human being, I don't know, I don't include him on my list. But to your question, like if they made a big risk, what I really wanna understand is how the important thing is how they took the risk out of it before disqualifying them for taking a big
Yeah,
risk.
yeah. So I like that. So, but I was making this thing. So right. So it's hard to not. I think it's all about risk management.
Yes.
That just seems right to me.
Which is which
And
is wh which is why and I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but, like, they at the video, they were kept debating Stanley Druckenmiller, who, if people don't know, his fund Duquesne has never had a down year. He also was the chief trader for George Soros. He was the chief trader who actually physically placed the bet, against the British pound, which made $1 billion for Soros, so many people consider him the greatest investor of all time. But using that same philosophy of when you think something is a big investment, you should bet big, they bet big, uh, on tech stocks at the exact wrong time and lost billions, and that's when, Druckenmiller left, Soros's fund and just focused on his own fund, and that's why he can say he, quote, unquote, "never had a down year" because he didn't stay the year, and, so that's why that was when I was thinking, "Huh, they don't really know all the issues here," and to your point, yes, that's when taking the big bet, and Julian Robertson at the Tiger Fund, also considered one of the best, also bet incorrectly on tech stocks at the wrong time. Uh, Also had some severe down years because of that. I don't include him on my list either.
We
But
talked. Oh, sorry.
Buffett seemed to get rid of his risk in various ways. He understood American Express's assets, plus their brand value, plus
But
maybe I'm
but
assuming
but I'm saying it, and it's got to be and it's got to like you reduce the risk on whether or not it's even a good choice. That is, you
yes,
sort of make it go. It's going to go up as opposed to go down. But then you have to take off the risk of going broke.
yes.
So then how much you bet, what fraction of your portfolio you bet, how much you hang out there,
Or
because otherwise,
there's got to be some information content in that as well, though.
yeah,
Because, like, for instance, I can put all my money on the S&P 500, and I know I'm not gonna go broke if I do that. I might go down, but I'm not gonna go broke.
right.
So he had some knowledge of the risk in this, like what their assets were that they could liquidate and so on, that he knew he wasn't gonna at least go broke. That's my assumption based on his prior history
Right.
of
I'm just saying
investing
you got
and
to
his
add, you
future
have to
history.
include that in any conversation about great investors, that you don't want to include a great investor who somehow made a ridiculous amount of money after putting themselves in a position where they could have gone broke, because
So so
that's not a good investor. That's just someone who had a good outcome.
so let's skip forward 45 years on Warren Buffett, and he takes the same approach, but in a completely different mode. The U.S. markets were falling apart. 2008, all the banks were supposedly going bankrupt. Uh, he put I forget the exact number. He put billions and billions of dollars into Goldman Sachs, which was at risk of going
Right.
bankrupt. But he didn't just invest in the stock. He called up the C This is why I don't like this particular bet in the what's the world's greatest investor, but it's the same philosophy. He called up the CEO, Lloyd Blankfein. He worked out his deal, which is, uh, I'm gonna invest in you. I'm gonna buy some X percentage of the company, but I want the highest preferred debt, meaning if you go bankrupt, I'm the first person who gets to liquidate
Yeah.
all of
So
your
he's protecting
assets,
himself
and I get a 9% dividend, which was insane, but they
at that
gave it to
time.
him,
Yeah.
and I get to convert my shares at this incredibly low price. So he made billions and billions on it and helped Goldman Sachs out at a hard time. But he wouldn't have. It was too risky to invest in the stock. He would not have done that. He knew they had enough assets. He would have made his money back, or at least not gone broke from it.
Right.
So again, it's the same style, but that's not open to the
Yeah.
average investor.
Right. So you're controlling the investment. So
Yeah,
even there, he's controlling his way out.
like
He's
like
paying attention at the investment moment to finding a way to make sure that he can get his money out if when he needs to. Or
kind of like a magician would. Like when you they say pick a card, any card, and you
it's a
pick a card,
force.
they know what card you're gonna pick.
Right.
right? Maybe they've showed you the deck. It's got all 52 cards. Then they quickly swap the deck, so it's only
Okay,
got
so
the seven of spades.
there's misjudgment, right? So that's a beautiful example of misjudgment. So the person who's like on the other side of the magic trick thinks they've picked a random card, and then it seems amazing when the magician reveals the card. Like, how could you have known? Well, how could he not know? Because he told you which card. So you're saying in that case, investments, the misjudgment is the good investor is making a buy that the other person is amazed when it actually turns out right, but he sort of forced it to turn out right.
Right, because like think about when Warren Buffett did announce this. I was actually at CNBC at the moment Warren Buffett announced this. At CNBC announced that he was doing this, and Goldman Sachs stock, the regular stock, started shooting up. I would say those people buying Goldman Sachs then were making mistakes because they were assuming, oh, if Warren's in it, it's good.
But they didn't have the same
They
deal.
didn't have the same deal as him, so they were making a misjudgment. Now
Right.
it worked out for them too, fortunately, because Warren Buffett's
So let's
ultimate
talk
theory
about
was
that
that.
misjudgment because I
Mhm.
think I think that's at the heart of it. So how did that misjudgment happen? So they saw something which they interpreted in one way. It's confirmation bias. They saw,
Yes.
if the stock is worth something, then I would see someone like Warren Buffett buying it. Now I see someone like Warren Buffett buying it, and therefore I think, well, that's evidence that it's worth something. But the disconfirmation is what they're missing. Is they don't go and check, for example, that maybe there's some reason that Warren Buffett's buying something different than what they're buying, or
Right.
not something else.
And also they were probably making the correct assumption that, look, ultimately Buffett wanted to make a lot of money on the investment, but he was protecting his downside. So he probably, we never know what he was thinking, but he probably still thought, look, there's a lot of value here, but I still need to protect the
Yeah.
investment. So I'm not going to buy the common. They're probably thinking, okay, he probably sees a lot of upside, so it's good enough to buy the common. So the question is, if they only put a small amount of the portfolio in, that might have been a good judgment. But if they put a big amount, thinking, "If Warren did it, I should do it," and put all my money in it, that would probably be a
Okay, so
misjudgment.
but at the very least, we can agree that like the people who bought following Warren, they weren't great investors.
Right.
Warren was a great investor because he may have actually figured out something to do, and these guys could have turned out to be bad investors. I mean, if you evaluate their investment based on the fact, well, they actually did make money because there was some information. It could have also turned out there wasn't enough information. If they didn't go to do the work, see, I think the part that's missing here is how much work does it take
Right.
to actually figure out whether or not you might be wrong.
Well,
And I think that's really important here.
right, so I'm agreeing with you because I'm assuming they didn't do the work, but I'm hoping they didn't take the risk either. So
Right.
maybe they only put a small like 1% of their portfolio in,
No,
whereas
so and
Buffett
that
might
and
have
that and that
done
and that
5%.
balances the risk on, like, you don't go broke, so at the very least, you should do that. But the other day at dinner, you said something that I thought was really interesting. I hadn't heard you say this before, that something's changed for you, which is you think you can tell when something's a fraud now that you couldn't necessarily tell was a fraud before. That there were
Yeah.
times when you're making investments before that ended up being somewhat fraudulent. So how does that fit into
But
this?
also I combine that with knowing that I'm susceptible to being convinced. I'm
Yeah.
easily convinced. So I knew that when I would meet the people in question, they would convince me they weren't fraud. So I had to have outside protection reminding me why I thought they were fraud initially.
Yeah, and I don't mean to keep sounding the same note, but I think that's the heart of it. It's like part of being a great investor is seeing a situation for what it actually is like and being able to know the difference between the ones that are real and the ones that aren't real. And the problem with being an average investor, a bad investor, is you're betting on things where you don't actually see what it's like. And the great investors are all people. We describe them as either they went out and did some work to figure something out, or if you talk about Soros, he's like he sees something macro and he's betting on something macro. I think that's at the heart of being a great investor is going to do the work to see the world the way it actually is.
Yes, and I agree. So we have to end soon. So I want to get to
Uh,
the second greatest investor, even though you honestly, or we can make this all about Warren Buffett because
no, who's the
Yeah.
second? Yeah.
there's material all about. We could talk about Warren Buffett forever because he is the greatest
Yeah.
investor of all time, and he's been involved in so many different investment
But
philosophies.
I noticed in your comments, you talked about how okay, I wouldn't include Charlie Munger by himself because he had some big failures, right?
Right. So Charlie Munger was clearly a genius. I'll look up that Harvard
Is
talk,
still,
for
yeah.
instance. His works, his theories of lattice work, how different domains intersect to kind of create. We've talked about this in other contexts, but how you intersect different ideas to become really knowledgeable at the intersection, and you bet on that, and you have an edge. Um, I want to look at that view, but Charlie Munger was so stubborn in some ways about his ideas that he stuck to them sometimes against other evidence.
Yeah.
So in his last 4 years of his fund in 1973 and 1974, Buffett was pulling back. He knew I happen to know that he knew in advance a recession was coming. At least that was his theory. Who knows if what he knew or whether he knew he was right, but his theory was there was a recession coming. He actually shut down his hedge fund, moved everybody into Berkshire Hathaway if they wanted to be, or into another fund that he recommended. He shut down his investment business, moved everything to Berkshire Hathaway, and basically laid low for a while. Munger kept his investment partnership open and lost 31% in 1970, 32% in 1973, 31% in 1974. Just big losses. Like that's, compounded. That's like almost whatever, 80% of, shut that down. Compounded, that's like 70 or 80% of his investors' money. And then finally, he shut down his partnership when he got his nearest or newest investors back to even. So that disqualified him for me.
It's interesting.
Otherwise, I would say, yeah,
Yeah.
he's probably one of the top 5. But now he's
What
not
was
even.
his error in judgment again? Like he just stuck.
He thought he could still find value in a situation where essentially the world was falling apart. Like the U.S. was having a recession, there was inflation, and there was an oil crisis, and it was much more difficult to find stocks that were
So,
gonna be that you could hold on to and win.
which now I'm just reminding, it's like every example we're thinking about is examples like at some margin, like the whole market's going to fall apart or some macro thing is going to happen or there's one company that's going to like be in really big trouble. Is that where the greatest investors always are? They find their way to the place where, because that wasn't true, for example, for Simons. I mean, Simons didn't need to have a catastrophic event like a black
Correct.
swan event that he was going to then bet on. He found that there was inefficiencies across I believe some inefficiencies across a broad swath of things. Then he had these sort of micro investments at scale.
Right. So that's why I have Jim Simons as number 2 because he has a 100% different approach
Hmm.
from Warren Buffett. And Jay, is David here? Okay. So with Jim Simons, by the way, short story, I was emailing back and forth with Jim Simons like 10 years ago, and he was very interested in the work I was doing because I was doing similar stuff to do using software to
Right, the
model the
back
market.
testing stuff.
And finally he said, "Oh, you got your PhD at Carnegie Mellon, right?" And I said, "No, I was thrown out by Dr. Merrick first."
Thanks.
And
So I ruined your life so many ways.
and he said, "I'm
That's
really
right.
sorry. We only hire PhDs." But
Is
it
that
was
true?
a
That's
true
a true
story.
story?
True story. So,
That's funny.
but
Can we hire Merrick?
That's really funny.
but these, and I really was like, oh darn, I really want. But he was great because he created an entirely new area of investing that didn't exist before, noticing that there were these arbitrages, these spreads between a stock's statistical value, which he defined. I mean, he was like a Nobel level mathematician,
Mhm.
and what they were trading at. And so he was able to mathematically model where entire countries' markets should be based on their interest rates, the value of their stocks, and so on. And he would like short Canada and go long the US, the currencies would buy some of the stocks to hedge. So he created an entirely new area of investment. So the point of him is, and the point of Buffett is, go to the place where nobody else is going.
Yeah.
Nobody else is going to the middle of Iowa and putting up signs to buy stocks. When Jim Simons came around in the when he came around, is nobody else was in that space at all
Yeah, yeah.
of using computers, which were fairly new for doing data analysis like this. No one was using computers to do this sort of analysis. I remember we had a guy who was maybe one class ahead of me at grad school. Jim Simons picked him up. I remember thinking like we were making a stipend of like you said 7,000 a year, and this guy tells me I quit graduate school, and I said, "Why'd you quit?" I'm going to go work for this guy Jim Simons. This is 1991 or something. He's offering me 300,000 a year plus bonus,
Yeah.
and I'm like, "Oh my god!" And I told my mother this, who's in the computer business. She's like, "That's impossible. Nobody pays that for a programmer." I'm like, "No, he's serious." I forget
Yeah,
the
he
guy's
has
name
several students. I know who it was. We'll talk about him later. Yeah.
because I think he got thrown out of Renaissance later.
He did, and then he went over to David Shaw's shop, and I actually just talked. I think I know who you're talking about. We'll talk
Oh,
about it
you know
later.
what? He started with Shaw.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. And then yeah. So,
yeah.
but because D.
If it's the
Shaw,
same guy, he was actually a Mormon missionary before he did all
yeah,
this.
yeah,
Yeah,
I know who it
yeah,
is. Yeah.
yeah.
So D. Shaw followed Jim Simons in doing this. Then
Right.
Cliff Asness at AQR followed. So Jim Simons created an entire industry, and that's how he was able to make 31% a year for his first God
Eh,
knows how many decades.
but he showed up at a time when people saying the efficient market, Bernard Malkiel
Yes.
was saying that you can't make money,
People
but
winning Nobel Prizes for that.
here's the thing. It's like what you know that ain't so. I think that's at the heart of a lot of this stuff. So what you know that ain't so is what you can go figure out by going out and to Iowa, like if you're
Yeah.
Warren Buffett. That's, I think, the puzzle is like if what you know ain't so, or what they know ain't so, and that's how they're trading. You can make money as an investor by knowing actually what's there, which might be what's actually so. So there's the puzzle. Like, how do you find out about what you know that ain't so? If you notice it, well, everybody else can notice it. Then you have no advantage.
Well,
Right.
I feel like I should contribute a quote. Isn't Buffett's quote like "Be fearful when everybody's greedy, and greedy when everybody's fearful"? I mean, that is going across a grain.
Yes. So that's not what they all do really, and that's
Yeah.
what even the software models is. They're able to model subtle times when people are fearful or greedy. What Warren Buffett so that's why it's really important. The biggest thing you have to ask is, what is my edge that no one else seems to be aware of?
Right.
Because and that's how you know something's a fraud, is if you always have to ask, why am I getting this opportunity and nobody else? Because if there isn't a really great answer, no one wakes up and thinks to themselves, I got to make James Altucher rich today.
Yeah.
Like, so if you're somehow getting an opportunity to make money, there's got to be a really good answer why it's you who's making it. So Warren Buffett has a good answer to that. He can say, I've read 8,000 financial reports for the past 10 years, and I'm willing to drive. I'm the only person willing to drive to Iowa. Jim Simons could say, I'm a Nobel level mathematician, and I'm going to apply all my knowledge. I'm going to be the first person to apply all of his knowledge to stocks and see what happens. He didn't know, oh, there's this advantage. Let's take into account
Yeah.
fees. There's this
Okay,
advantage.
I got to jump in now because I think there's something really important in what you're saying, which is you have to have some advantage, but where does it come from? I think people make a mistake. They think it comes from their head. I think they just think, oh, I have an insight and it comes from their head. I don't think that's right. I think and all the examples I think you've been saying support that, which of course is confirmation bias. People go out and they act in the world. They do something, and then the world reacts in some way, and they notice what it does, and then through that, they figure out something, and that gives them the advantage. So in
Yes.
every situation, like Jim Simon, anybody could have said, there are probably zillions of mathematicians that could have said, there's some arbitrage opportunity, but they didn't go and get the data and run the models and try it. Anybody could have said that there's some company that's undervalued and there might be some shares that I could go convince farmers to sell me, but somebody actually went out and did it. I think that's part of what makes someone a great investor too.
Yeah. So years or decades of experience. Don't forget, Buffett trained under Benjamin Graham, who was probably the greatest investor at that time.
Yeah.
And by the way, the reason Graham didn't hire Buffett permanently is because Buffett was not Jewish. And Graham specifically said to Buffett, all the other firms are not hiring Jewish people. So I have to hire only Jewish people to keep the balance. So unfortunately, Warren, I can't hire you. So Warren Buffett went back to Omaha and started his business, and history was made. But Warren had a decade or two of experience investing already,
Hmm.
and he was in Omaha, away, artificially disconnected from Wall Street, where supposedly the information flow happened. So he had to find his information in a unique way. Jim Simons was also coming from another world, had to find his information in a unique way. But I want to mention just two things to close. One is, this just reminded me, you were offered a job to run the quant desk, I think at
Kidder Peabody.
Kidder Peabody.
Yeah, like the
Okay.
year before they collapsed. It was pretty
And it
funny.
was right around that time too.
Yeah, I was gonna
And
be the
you
chief computer scientist. Yeah.
and you would have made I won't tell you the deal. I won't say out loud the deal that they gave you, but it was a really
It
great
was a
deal.
serious deal,
It
yeah.
was a deal that would have retired you in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. But I remember you were doubting it. You were here in New York City and you got hit by a bus and that convinced you.
You remember that? I walked out of the interview and I was gonna head home, and actually worse than that, my wife was in New Haven. We were living in New Haven at the time, and she was on bed rest with a baby because the baby was, like, premature, and they take me to Beth Israel Hospital from this bus accident. I got hit at Broad and Wall Street, and the bus just hit me. I heard these people screaming, "Look out, he's gonna get hit," and I looked up, and it was me. And the nurse has to call my wife, and I'm telling her, "Don't say the wrong thing," because she's, like, gonna go into a premature labor. It was I just remember I still remember the woman said, "Don't worry, he's in the hospital, but he's okay," and I was thinking that was, like, the wrong thing to say, but
Now,
somehow
now
it all worked out.
right. And do you ever regret it? Because obviously you would have made a lot of money and that was a great field
There
to
were
be in.
times there were times after that when I, like, was hurting for money and, now things have changed a lot, but, yeah, there were times when I thought that would have been an interesting life, but no, I don't
You
think
didn't want
so.
to do it anyway.
Yeah,
They
I
told
don't
you
know
you were
if I
gonna
would
work
have
like
been
100 hours a week
I
and
didn't know if I would have been good at it actually. It was interesting.
you
It
would have
was
been good
early. It
at
was
it.
really early.
This
But
guy's very smart. He would have been
yeah,
good.
yeah.
But
Okay, sorry.
but
That's
the other thing I want to close with, just to think about, because we didn't get to all five, but my third has an interesting story. So, but and to all of your points, the kind of homework assignment is, what was his edge? John Templeton, who later became the head of a huge mutual fund, he kind of was the forerunner of the entire mutual fund industry. But his very first big investment, 1939, the market had been in a depression for 10 years. He took all his money and he put $100 in every single stock that was trading below $1 on the New York Stock Exchange. That's all he did. It was just a blanket trade on
Wow.
every stock that was trading in the pennies on the New York Stock Exchange. And he, I don't know, made some huge amount on that money and used that to start his first mutual fund business. So
that's like a Nassim Taleb. You'd be basically betting on the Black Swan event.
yeah, and he could have, if he had done it any other year, he would have lost the money.
Hmm.
And but this year was the beginning of war. Boom, that reinvigorated the market, and he made the money. But the question is, to your point, how did he really? I encourage people to research. How did he remove the risk from that decision? Why then? It's an interesting story. He's an interesting story, and again, he created his own branch of the investment history by starting the mutual fund industry, just like Warren Buffett. You know, did his thing and Jim Simons did his thing. And I'll argue, Carl Icahn did his thing. But thanks very much for
Hey, this was
the
fun.
the five
Thanks,
greatest
Steve.
investor of all time. We only really talked about two of them and maybe a little the third, but we talked about investing in general.
Steve tried to keep us on track. He
Yes,
really-
and we talked about how to
For
manage.
once in my life.
But I think we did hit the main points, which is
Yeah.
how are you managing risk? How are you getting your edge? What are you doing that's uniquely you? And all and other components of what makes particularly these
And
first
I
two
want to say
great.
it's possible. I mean, I've met people who have made an incredible amount of money in investing, so it's
Yes,
possible.
it is possible. I know it is possible. By the way, I kind of narrowed this window to include the publicly known people
Yeah.
playing with billions of dollars because that's an extra challenge. But I know plenty of people who privately have made significantly more in terms of percentage returns than these guys. But that's a topic for another podcast. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Merrick.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
thank you,
inviting me.
Merrick,
This
for
was
joining
fun.
us. Thanks, Steve, once again.